Here we go, Mr Speaker, the other side once again showing that they have not learnt the lessons of the last 2 years. And it's interesting listening in this House, Mr Speaker, they constantly put the cart before the horse. They keep thinking up new ways to spend more money that we do not have as a country. That's their solution. It was their solution for the previous 9 years. It was the solution that got us into this mess. And, Mr Speaker, that would be the solution they would adopt at the end of this year, and it would be a disastrous situation for this country. It would, in fact, Mr Speaker, be economic vandalism. It's economic vandalism, Mr Speaker. Let's go back in history for the so-called boom times of the previous government when we had runaway consumption, government spending and property speculation, Mr Speaker. We had a tradable sector that was in reverse for 5 years. They never talk about that, but that's actually what was going. Inflation hit 5% just before they left office. We were in recession in this country before the global financial crisis. And when the global financial crisis came, the tide went out, and as Warren Buffett is fond of saying, when the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And the previous Labor government, Mr Speaker, was swimming naked, and it was not a pretty sight. It was not a pretty sight, Mr Speaker. And we inherited, when we became the government, as well as that terrible thought, we inherited a decade of deficits projected forward for 10 years because of their horrible increase in spending. You know, in the last 5 years of their government, they increased spending by $2.8 billion more every year. So it was $2.8 billion the first year, then 2.8 plus 2.8 the second year, then 2.8 plus 2.8 plus 2.8 the third year. It's all correct, Mr Speaker. They managed to push government spending up 50% in 6 years. They were economic vandals then, Mr Speaker, and they're economic vandals now. So this government, Mr Speaker, has come up with a very strong plan to build for stronger growth in this country, Mr Speaker. And it's interesting, they can't decide whether they don't like the plan or we haven't got a plan. They're still flip-flopping between that particular line of opposition argument. It's either we haven't got a plan or we don't like the plan, but they can't make up their mind, Mr Speaker. Well, we have a very strong plan, Mr Speaker, and let's be blunt, they don't like it because it is the solutions for real growth in an economy, Mr Speaker. They don't have those solutions. They ignored them for 9 years when they were in government, and they want to ignore them again, and they want to go back. They talk about foreign ownership. They want to go back and hock themselves off to the foreign banks so they can spend some more money and make themselves more popular in the short term, exactly the same way they did when you were in the Prime Minister's office, Mr Robertson, spending money like there was no tomorrow. They just want to go back and do that again at the end of this year. Well, thank goodness there is no sign that the people of this country are going to fall for that a second time. Absolutely no sign. You're going to have to come up with a new songbook on the Labor benches because there is no sign that the people of this country will fall for that rubbish twice. So, a plan, Mr Speaker, to build for stronger growth, and it starts with building stronger government accounts. We have to have tighter fiscal control which will stabilise and reduce our government debt, which will lead to lower exchange rates and interest rates over the cycle. You don't do it by having a little opposition group get together and say, oh, it's terrible, the exchange rates are high. You actually do it with practical economics, which is taking the pressure off the Reserve Bank to lift interest rates and for exchange rates to rise. And these guys do not understand it. The second thing, Mr Speaker, is we have to build exports. We have to build exports in this country. We are a trading nation. These guys forgot about it for 5 years. We have to get back where we're focusing on building exports. Now, how do we do that? Well, we can't just magic companies out of thin air with a task force, which is basically what Labor tried to do over 9 years. We have to actually send out talented ministers like McCulley and Grosser to leverage our discussions for free trade agreements, which we're doing. You have to get, as I said, the exchange rates right, and you actually have to encourage business, Mr Speaker. You have to give business confidence. So how do you do that? You have to show you understand business, Mr Speaker. You have to build business confidence by controlling the costs of doing business, by reducing red tape on the business sectors, like the RMA, like the Building Act, like some of the things that have been done in local government in Auckland. You deliver more competition in the utilities markets, like electricity, that Mr Brownlee's been working on. And you deliver things that provide flexibility in the labour markets, which encourage employers to employ and gives people the opportunity to have those jobs. And that 90-day probational period, Mr Speaker, people will look back and say, what was the fuss about? Because it created great jobs in this country, and they won't be interested in the ideological rubbish from the opposition, Mr Speaker. And then you build infrastructure for growth. I saw the pending leader of the Labor Party, Mr Little, Andrew Little, the pending leader of the Labor Party, actually on Radio New Zealand last week. Well, he's on Radio New Zealand, so I suppose he's almost there. He was there saying the government should build some infrastructure. Well, hallelujah, 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 Mr Little. The government is investing massive amounts in the national electricity grid, massive amounts in the roads of national significance, and indeed, according to the Greens, way too much. We're investing on the Kiwi Rail turnaround plan, investing in ultra-fast broadband and rural broadband, a whole range of things, Mr Speaker. And in fact, what we've done is we've ring-fenced some spend, which in past times governments have said we can't afford infrastructure, and we've said we have to commit to that infrastructure so that when we come out and we get stronger growth, we don't have the bottlenecks that we had going in, Mr Speaker, and that's the foresightedness of this government, Mr Speaker. We also have to build skills for growth, and this is where they really are telling porkies. And this is all this rubbish about, oh, they've cut this, they've cut that. Mr Speaker, we're spending more on early childhood education than we ever have before in this country, and that is a simple fact. It's a simple fact, Mr Speaker, and no matter how many times they say it, it cannot be true that they're cutting it, and all they have to do is go and look at the books, Mr Speaker. We are spending more, we have more places in tertiary education in this country, Mr Speaker, than we have ever had in this country. We have 16,000 or more places than 3 years ago. Who was in government 3 years ago? It was the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party were in government 3 years ago, and they had 16,000 less places at universities than we have today, Mr Speaker. So we're building skills for growth, and we're building savings and investment. We're listing minority stakes. That's the plan, to list minority stakes in SOE companies, and they're against that too, Mr Speaker. They think that somehow this means that the SOEs are going to be sold off overseas. Now, they've got a little problem there with percentages for a kick-off, because 51% in government ownership is more than half when I went to school, and it really is time they sorted out their maths in that respect. It's being held at least 51% by the government of the day, and as the Prime Minister says, priority given to New Zealand investors, Mr Speaker, so New Zealand mums and dads can share in the upside for these companies. It gives these companies the opportunity to invest overseas, Mr Speaker, which they can't do now, and it really is a win-win for all parties, except for the ideologically bound over there on the Labor benches, Mr Speaker. So we've got a plan. They don't like the plan. They don't like the plan. They would rather we went away and didn't do the plan. Their plan is to spend more money. Their plan is they've found a money tree and they just want to keep cutting the money off the money tree, and that's the extent of their plan. It is economic vandalism, Mr Speaker. This year, this election year, in the first month of this year, in the Economic Desperation Index, the leader of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, shot right through the roof with the Economic Desperation Index, with a couple of $1 billion of promises for more spending before the end of January. Before the end of January, Mr Speaker. So he's over a couple of $1 billion, yet no idea where it's coming from. Some plan to soak the rich or something like that. What he doesn't realise, of course, is that actually labour mobility was what actually killed, one other thing that killed this economy through the 2000s, Mr Speaker, with the 39-cent tax rate sent a whole bunch of people overseas. But that's okay, he's proposing a 50-something cent tax rate for the top earners in this country. So we lose all the people that we need for our hospitals and for our schools. We send those all overseas. This is remarkably reminiscent, Mr Speaker, of the 2000s and the Labor Party in the 2000s, and no surprise there, because they're all still over there and they're all running the same song. And in fact, Mr Speaker, they're fighting the wrong war. They're fighting the war when they all had money to burn, and that was 2005. They were fighting the last, not the last war, but the one before, and they really have to wake up and get into the second decade of the 21st century. They're acting like economic vandals, Mr Speaker, and they're also being xenophobic. I heard the leader of the opposition yesterday saying it was outrageous that some Germans had bought a little bit of rural land in the South Island, and that's the desperation of this opposition, Mr Speaker. So what they have to do is they have to work out that actually New Zealand is interested in how we grow the economy, and we have to do that, Mr Speaker, before we start working out how to spend the money we don't have. This government has a plan to build stronger growth, Mr Speaker. This government has a plan to build a brighter future for this country. New Zealanders support it, and that's what we'll be doing this year.
Paul Cathro.